You check, and before you even realize it, you're already checking again. Not because you need to, not because something actually changed, but because something inside you doesn't settle until you do. Have you noticed that? That subtle urge that doesn't feel exactly like a decision, but also doesn't feel random. It feels necessary, almost automatic. Like if you don't check, something might slip. Something might go wrong. Something might be missed. And even if nothing happens, the discomfort stays. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think it's about habit, or distraction, or lack of discipline. But what's driving this behavior goes deeper, much deeper. Because this is not just checking. This is a regulatory pattern, a way your brain tries to reduce uncertainty. And once you understand this, the behavior starts to make sense. Let's break it down. Your brain is constantly predicting. It's scanning for mismatches between what it expects and what is actually happening. And when there is a gap, it creates tension. Not dramatic tension, subtle tension. The kind that feels like, just take a look, just make sure, just confirm. That just is not small, it's the hook. Because every time you check, you close a prediction gap. You confirm that nothing changed. You verify that everything is okay. And when that happens, your brain releases a small signal of relief, not pleasure, relief. And relief is powerful because it tells the system, this worked, do it again next time. Now think about this carefully. If checking reduces uncertainty, and reducing uncertainty feels relieving, your brain starts associating checking with safety, and safety becomes the goal, not awareness, not information. Safety. That's when the loop begins. You check. You feel a brief sense of resolution, and then, after a while, the uncertainty returns, because the world is constantly changing, and your brain knows that, so it doesn't fully trust the last check. It wants a new one, and then another, and another. Not because things are actually changing fast, but because the system doesn't stay convinced for long. This is called uncertainty intolerance. The difficulty in staying at ease without confirmation, and the more you respond to it, the stronger it becomes. Because each time you check, you're teaching your brain, you were right to doubt. Checking was necessary. Don't relax without it. Now here's something even more interesting. The behavior expands. It starts in one area, maybe messages, notifications, work updates, social media, but over time, it spreads. You begin to check other things, doors, schedules, tasks, information, even thoughts. Yes, thoughts. You start mentally reviewing. Did I say that right? Did I miss something? Should I check again? This is not random. This is pattern generalization. Your brain takes a strategy that reduced uncertainty in one context and applies it to others. Because from its perspective, it's working. Now here's the paradox. The more you check, the less your system trusts itself, because you're outsourcing certainty. Instead of holding a stable internal reference, you rely on external confirmation, and over time, your baseline confidence drops, which increases the need to check. This creates a feedback loop. Check, relief, doubt, check again. And because the relief is real, the loop becomes convincing, it feels justified. But what's actually happening is that the system is losing tolerance to uncertainty, and uncertainty is unavoidable. Now let's go deeper. There is a concept in cognitive science called predictive processing. It suggests that the brain is not reacting to reality. It is constantly predicting reality, and checking is a way of updating predictions. But here's the key detail. When the system becomes over-reliant on updates, it stops stabilizing. It keeps refreshing, like a page that never fully loads. That's why the behavior doesn't end. Because the system is not looking for information, it's looking for closure. And closure is temporary. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever checked something and immediately after felt the urge to check again, even knowing nothing changed? That moment is critical because it shows that the behavior is not about logic, it's about state. The system is still activated, and checking becomes a way to manage that activation, not to solve anything, just to regulate. Now imagine what happens over time. Your brain learns, whenever I feel this tension, I check. And slowly, that tension becomes more frequent because the system is more sensitive. This is how a small pattern becomes a constant behavior. But there's another layer, something even less obvious. Checking is not only about reducing uncertainty, it's also about maintaining a sense of control. When you check, you feel like you are tracking reality, like you are staying ahead, like you are preventing something, and that creates a sense of agency, even if nothing is actually being controlled. Now here's the important part. When control becomes tied to checking, not checking feels like losing control, and losing control feels unsafe, so the system pushes you back into the behavior. This is where many people get stuck, because they don't see the underlying mechanism. They only see the action, and they try to stop it directly. Just don't check. Just ignore it. But that rarely works. Because the action is not the problem. The function is. Checking serves a purpose. It reduces tension. It creates relief. It simulates control. If you remove it without understanding, the system looks for another way. Now let's shift perspective. Instead of asking, why can't I stop checking? Ask, what does checking give me that I don't have without it? This question changes everything because it reveals the function. And once you see the function, you can work with the system, not against it. Now observe something. The urge to check always comes with a sensation, a subtle internal signal. It can feel like restlessness, incomplete feeling, light pressure, anticipation. That signal is not the problem. It's information. It's the system saying something is unresolved. But here's the key. It doesn't mean something actually is unresolved. It means the system perceives it that way. And perception drives behavior. Now imagine this. What if, instead of immediately checking, you stayed with that sensation for a few seconds, not forcing anything, not suppressing, just observing? At first, the urge might increase. That's expected, because the system is used to immediate resolution. But if you stay, something interesting happens. The sensation starts to shift, not disappear instantly, but change. Because the system is learning that it doesn't need to act immediately. This is called response flexibility, the ability to feel an impulse without executing it. And this is where change begins, not by force, but by creating space. Now another important concept, attentional reinforcement. Whatever you repeatedly respond to gains strength. If every urge leads to checking, the urge becomes stronger. If some urges are observed without action, the system recalibrates. It learns, this is not urgent, this can pass, and over time, the intensity reduces, but this requires consistency, not perfection, consistency. Now think about your day. How many times do you check something without even realizing? That's automation. And automation is efficient, but it also means you're not choosing, you're following a pattern. The goal is not to eliminate checking. It's to regain choice, to be able to check when it's useful, not when it's driven by tension. That distinction is crucial, because one is functional, the other is regulatory. Now let's connect this to a deeper layer. Your system is not trying to create a problem. It's trying to prevent one, even if that prevention is unnecessary. From its perspective, it's protecting you from uncertainty, from surprise, from loss of control. And that's why the behavior persists, because it's rooted in protection. Now here's the final shift. Instead of fighting the behavior, start understanding the signal. Every urge to check is a message, not a command. And when you begin to treat it that way, the relationship changes. You're no longer reacting automatically. You're interpreting. And when interpretation replaces reaction, the system begins to reorganize. Gradually, naturally, without force. Now think about this. What if the goal is not to stop checking, but to no longer need it? That changes the entire approach, because the focus moves from action to state, from behavior to perception. And once the state changes, the behavior follows. Not because you forced it, but because it's no longer necessary. And that's where real change happens. Quietly, consistently, from the inside out. Because the system interprets checking as a form of control. And control, for the brain, reduces uncertainty. Even if only for a few seconds, you check, you confirm, you feel a brief relief, and then the cycle starts again. Because the relief does not last, it never lasts. And that is exactly what reinforces the behavior. There is a concept in behavioral neuroscience called intermittent reinforcement. It is the same principle behind addictions. When a behavior sometimes brings relief, but not always, the brain becomes even more attached to it, because it keeps searching for that moment of resolution. And checking becomes exactly that. A loop driven not by logic, but by expectation. Now think about this. If the brain learns that checking might reduce discomfort, even occasionally, it starts to prioritize that behavior, not because it solves the problem, but because it promises a temporary sense of control. And this is where the pattern becomes stronger, because over time, checking stops being a response and becomes a default, something automatic, something that happens before you even realize it. Now observe something important. The more you check, the less certainty you actually feel. At first, this seems contradictory, but it makes sense. Because every time you check, you reinforce the idea that something needs to be checked. You validate the uncertainty. You tell the brain, this matters, this is not resolved yet. And the brain responds by maintaining the alert. This is known as uncertainty amplification. The behavior that was supposed to reduce doubt ends up increasing sensitivity to doubt. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever checked something and right after felt the need to check again, even though nothing changed? That is not forgetfulness. That is the system failing to register completion, because the internal state did not shift. The action happened, but the system did not update. And without that internal update, the loop remains open. This connects to another important concept, cognitive closure. The brain seeks closure. It wants to feel that something is finished, resolved, complete. But closure is not created only by action. It is created by state. If the state remains activated, the brain does not feel closure, even if the task is done. And so, it keeps returning, checking again, trying to reach a sense of completion that never fully arrives. Now here is something most people do not realize. The problem is not that you check too much. The problem is that the system does not recognize when it can stop. And this changes everything, because it shifts the focus away from the behavior and toward the mechanism. Now let's go deeper. There is also a strong link between checking behavior and something called predictive processing. The brain is constantly predicting what might happen next. It builds models of the world and updates those models based on feedback. When there is uncertainty, the brain increases sampling. In simple terms, it gathers more information. Checking is a form of sampling. But when the model itself is unstable, no amount of sampling feels sufficient because the prediction error remains high. And so the brain keeps checking, trying to reduce that error, trying to stabilize the model. But the more it checks, the more it reinforces the instability because it signals that the prediction was not reliable. This is a loop, a self-maintaining system. Now notice something subtle. The urge to check often appears before a clear thought. It feels like a pull, a tension, a sense that something needs attention, and only after that comes the thought, let me just check. This order is important because it shows that the behavior is not driven by reasoning. It is driven by state. The thought is just a justification, a way for the mind to make sense of the urge. Now consider this. If the urge comes from the state, then trying to stop the behavior only at the level of thought will not be enough, because the state will still generate the urge. And this is why many people say, I know I don't need to check, but I still do. That is not lack of discipline. It is a mismatch between levels. The conscious mind understands, but the automatic system is still active. Now let's connect this with the body, because the body plays a crucial role here. When the system is in a mild state of activation, the body reflects that. Slight tension, subtle restlessness, micro movements. These signals feed back into the brain, reinforcing the sense that something is not settled. And the brain responds by maintaining vigilance, and vigilance seeks confirmation, and confirmation becomes checking. Now we have a full loop. Internal activation creates tension, tension signals uncertainty, uncertainty drives checking, checking reinforces activation, and the cycle continues. Now here is the key insight. Breaking the loop does not start by stopping the checking. It starts by changing the state that generates the urge, because if the state changes, the urge weakens. And when the urge weakens, the behavior becomes easier to shift. But if the state remains the same, forcing yourself to stop checking creates conflict. And conflict increases activation, which brings the urge back even stronger. This is why suppression rarely works and often backfires. Now think about this. What if the goal was not to stop checking, but to reduce the need to check? This changes the strategy completely, because now the focus is not on control, but on regulation. Not on resisting the behavior, but on understanding what sustains it. And this is where real change begins, because once you see the mechanism, you stop fighting the symptom and start influencing the system. And when the system changes, the behavior follows, naturally, gradually, without force. Now there is still one more layer to explore, because for many people, this pattern is not only about uncertainty, it is also about identity, about how they relate to responsibility, control, and safety. And that is exactly what we are going to explore next, because understanding this deeper layer is what finally explains why stopping feels so difficult and what actually allows the system to let go.